How's your social life these days? For business leaders, it's an increasingly pertinent question. Having a social business is tantalizing to many kinds of companies. They constantly see or hear about Facebook and Twitter and what have you. People are putting their Twitter handles on their business cards in place of email, and the press is full of social success stories. But recent research by MIT Sloan Management Review and Deloitte shows that many companies find it hard to get full business benefits from being social. It seems obvious that they should get improvements, but many social media projects, internal and external, simply fail to deliver. That was one of the big takeaways from the 2013 Social Business Global Executive Study and Research Project. So, what makes a good social business? Well, it uses social media, social networks, and social software to achieve better connections between people, assets, and information. If you can do these things well, your company should see better business results, but many do not. So how can companies leverage the social business phenomenon? Well, I'm Michael Fitzgerald, a contributing editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'm here today to talk with several of the bright lights of the field about just that question. To my far right is Gerald Kane. He's Associate Professor of Information Systems at Boston College's Carroll School of Management. Next to me is Doug Palmer, who leads Deloitte's social business practice. And in between, Nguyen Phillips, Senior Manager in Deloitte's Strategy, Brand, and Innovation Group. We're going to focus on three aspects of social business: the major findings of the research, the way social tools change business dynamics, and just what a social business looks like. Jerry, let's start with you. 70% of respondents in this report believe that social business is an opportunity to fundamentally change the way their organization works. And so the importance of social business is rising across industries. What kind of benefits are companies getting from social business that they've not been getting from older knowledge management and collaboration tools?
Well, social's very different than the previous generation of knowledge management tools in a couple of ways. One, unlike the previous generation, social is much more flexible and adaptable to the way people actually collaborate. And then the second way is it actually opens up who is collaborating. Previous knowledge management tools really locked down collaboration within the organization. Now social allows companies to collaborate with customers and with business partners inside and outside and across the boundaries of the organization, which really describes much more of how business is actually done and really unleashes the power of and the potential of collaboration.
Doug, what's holding back some companies from getting social tech benefits?
Right, so the definition you gave of social media, social software, and social networks, it's really the convergence of those pieces. And where you tend to see the first value is with the consumer. So CMOs and the marketing side have gotten this. But what we're talking about is how does this apply to the broader enterprise and how does it apply to the supply chain? And the examples that we'll talk about today, I think we'll give examples of all three about how this is transformative across your business.
So what kind of barriers do companies run into when they're trying to achieve a more social business?
We found a few sort of surface up to the top of our research. The first one is not having an overall strategy towards social. The second one is organizations are finding it hard to sort of prioritize, and there are too many competing things gaining their attention. And finally, there's no business case. So that becomes a big one as well.
We saw a difference when the executives, whether that be the CEO, the CMO, the Chief Operating Officer, cared about this. And when they paid attention, the organization paid attention.
How do they show this care? I mean, is this involving, I'm going to go tweet now as the CEO, or what's it look like?
Last year in the report, what we saw was people that were using enterprise collaboration, social software tools that the CEO or the leader was involved and engaged. And that was a way that they could spread their message and their word, to the employees, to the distributed workforce, that they would not get to hear that voice. It became much more personal. I think what we saw this year was much more about the CMO or somebody in the business line actually using this for business value. So it wasn't collaboration for collaboration's sake, but they're actually solving real business problems.
And there's more than that, actually. So it's about the leadership driving a social culture within the organization. I think that's absolutely critical.
Is it surprising to you? Do you think that social media being kind of social, does it make sense that it would be driven from the top?
It absolutely does, because the more successful social businesses out there and the more mature social businesses have social as a pervasive in their entire organization. And if you don't have it in the leadership, you can't get it anywhere else. And we've actually noticed that there's a correlation and a connection between how mature a social organization is and whether or not it's supported by leadership.
Doug, is there a broader framework for leaders to think about social business?
Sure. One of the things we put together in year one that we found held in year two was something we call the Milo Framework, where Milo stood for marketing, innovation, leadership, and operations. And marketing is pretty straightforward. Innovation is the insights that you get from social data, what competitors are doing, product improvements, customer service improvements that you can bring to your business. Leadership is really the talent agenda. How do you use social tools and technologies to interact with your employee base and to be able to develop them, to make sure your message is being heard as a leader in the organization? And then operations is how do you run the business? How do you socialize the call center? How do you work with business partners? That there's a whole bunch of aspects that as companies mature in a social business, those are the elements that they have to hit on.
You have this really nice image in the report. You talk about companies getting stuck in first gear. I know there's not a lot of standard transmission cars anymore, but you know that inability to get out of first gear into second is a theme that I really liked in this report. And so how do managers shift to a higher gear in social business?
There are several things that we've noticed mature social organizations doing. One we talked about before, which is focusing on business challenges. Two is to have their leaders get behind it, support the initiatives, and actually lead a social culture throughout the entire organization. Three is to really focus on content. And we've seen an organization, for example, launch their social site, and it goes really well at the beginning, but what we see a lot of times is it ends up flopping because there's not continuous valuable content. And so there is a certain degree of focus that you need to put on in terms of creating and curating meaningful content that will bring people back to the social network or to the social site. The fourth thing is measuring what matters. And finally, it's about taking social and really using it to fundamentally change the way we worked. And we talked about 70% of our respondents to a survey believe that it can change it. So now it's a matter of doing it.
Well, and the interesting part is year one, we saw what we called the promise of social, that the curve was up and to the right, but it was, an 18, 20% in terms of people that were getting value today. And they said, oh, we might get about 40% a year from now. Well, we actually saw that data realized that when people reported out this year, they were starting to see that value. So we're at least in first gear, where we weren't even on the road previously.
Well, I have to say, on listening to you talk about those 5 things, I thought to myself, okay, so we're actually not driving a car, we're moving in a truck, and there's a lot more gears that we have to be able to master. Yeah, are there some key drivers within those things that really help move change?
We talked before about focusing on specific business challenges, so that's absolutely one. And then there's a leadership component too, which is, we've seen the organizations that are the most socially mature have strong leaders behind their social initiatives. And they really drive it throughout the entire organization. But the content piece is important as well. And measurement, we've been talking about measurement. And really, the last piece is actually critical. It's about not just putting social as a new technology tool on top of what you do, but it's about figuring out how you can change your processes and re-engineer your business processes so that social can enable them in a more effective way.
So how hard is that? Can you give me an example of a company that you think has been able to do that? I mean, whenever you hear process re-engineering, it's got a lot of syllables and you get, ooh, what's that mean?
One that we could talk about is really thinking about how people do digital marketing at a global scale. So what you might see today is someone with lots of different Facebook pages, lots of different accounts across the world. And as An said, content is king. How do I provide centralized content that can be provided globally but customized locally? Now all of a sudden I have the ability, because of social technologies, to be able to do that. And then it allows me to look at my organizational structure behind that I can connect the marketing side with the analytics side. And all of a sudden I can say, I ran this campaign, here's the data that came out of it because it was tagged properly. And I can get a whole different set of results in that process. And so there's a case of kind of re-engineering, if you will, the marketing function because of social technologies.
So what I hear underneath that, though, if I'm an employee, I'm thinking, this is 24/7 by 365. I want to get some sleep sometime. How do you manage through that kind of consumer effect?
I think in some respects that's where business is today, and to ignore that is not going to make the problem go away. Mm-hmm. And so the ability to leverage the tools and technologies and to be able to work across the globe is something that certainly our large firms and clients are asking for.
This, to me, is a kind of vexing problem for managers, because there's this constant flow of information. Do I micromanage this? I mean, Jerry, is there a way to lead a more social culture that doesn't require me to be kind of constantly checking my dashboard?
I think there are two answers to this question. One, I think knowledge is power. And if the CEO and the CMO and the CIO don't understand social and don't have a fairly sophisticated knowledge of it, it's hard to lead. And it's not something you can delegate to directors. It's not something you can delegate to interns. Most of the mature companies I've worked with do give social training to their C-suite employees so that they at least know what a social business looks like, what these social tools do. Second is, I'm not sure you necessarily need to respond 24/7, but be prepared to respond. Companies are increasingly moving towards having sort of a ready team. If you think about the Oreo Super Bowl commercial, they were prepared to respond. They were able to, so the lights go out in the Super Bowl, they had a team ready, they had all the processes in place, 18 months in the making, that they could execute quickly. So I think it's about more being sort of the firefighter mentality, where you've got people on call that when they are needed, they can respond, rather than being at a state of hyper readiness all the time.
It's kind of the Andy Grove, only the paranoid survive mentality. Really needs to be part of your process.
Well, there's certainly the early warning signs that social signals will give you, and then what is your plan to deal with brand reputation and respond? And if you do it well, it's good for the company. If you do it poorly, it ends up being a very challenging thing to recover from.
Are there industries that seem to get more out of being a social business than others?
There are definitely ones that lead, and what we found in our survey is 2 years in a row, it's those in the TMT industries, technology, telecoms, and media, that we found to actually be the leaders. And then we found that there are some that are the laggards, but what we've seen between year 1 and year 2 is that the laggards are catching up, and they're starting to understand the importance of social.
Because one of the laggards early on were energy and utility companies. But if you think about your local utility and the ability to crowdsource outages or to understand what a repair cycle is, those have been some of the best examples. Or community coming together relative to energy reduction programs and competing with each other. It's interesting to see how you can kind of change behavior based on using these social tools and technologies.
And I think any company or any industry that is fundamentally based on information or knowledge is going to be able to benefit from social tools. And increasingly, that's most industries and most companies.
So what about this 80% failure number? If I'm an executive looking to invest in technology, I'm going to look at that and say, well, maybe we should sort of slow down here. How do you get past skepticism within an organization?
Well, I think nowadays the major expense is not the technology, it's the employee time. And so it's not about investing out there and getting the right tools, it's about creating that right culture, about creating that right environment and structure to enable social to happen. I think the tools, they still have a ways to go, but they're there. Those aren't the problems we're facing.
And it's really about engaging your consumers, it's about engaging your employees and engaging your business partners. And at the point that you interact with them and they understand your product and they're engaged, good things happen. Whether that means they buy more products, they represent you better in the marketplace, or they're more loyal. Those are the things that we're starting to see.
Why is collaboration so important? Why is it not just employees wasting time?
Collaboration is increasingly how work is getting done in organizations. In knowledge work, it's about knowledge creation. In operations, it's about efficient interactions. And if we can do that both more efficiently and more effectively, and I think social business provides that opportunity, not only to do things in ways that used to take a lot longer, but to create new connections and new opportunities that we didn't have before.
So let's say that I'm a leader who's trying to figure out how I can make my business more social or take advantage of the social opportunities that are there. What do I do?
Well, there are a few things. One is the leaders need to actually lead the social strategy. They need to explain what kind of processes are going to change and why we're doing this. Second, they need to signal the importance of social and sort of show, either by personal use and other things, to their employees why it's important to adopt social. And finally, they need to have the right attitude about measurement. So it's not about measuring every tiny little thing. It's about measuring and adjusting where you can. So the first year you might be measuring just a few things. The second year, as you get better, you'll be figuring out where the measurements actually count.
And I think this leadership opportunity that social provides is enormous, that it really gives CEOs an opportunity both to communicate to their employees in a much more effective way and a much more regular way. It enables them to listen to their employees in ways that they were not able to do before, to aggregate thoughts and comments. And it's going to what An said about CEOs needing to use it personally. There was a saying on my business school wall that said, communication is the only job that a leader cannot delegate. And social media is primarily about communication, and if the CEO is going to abdicate that to someone else, they are abdicating sort of their leadership opportunity.
I think this is a perfect point to make a segue into kind of our next topic, which is to look at what does a social business really look like?
Let's talk about the phases that we saw. So we asked people in the survey to self-rate where they were on a scale of 1 to 10. And what we found was over half were in what we would call the early stage, that they were still piloting, they were experimenting, they might have somebody that was a social evangelist, there might be somebody assigned responsibility to lead social for the organization. Then we saw a middle, which was about maybe 31, 32%, that was developing. So they had done their first one, they'd advanced, it was starting to become more pervasive across the organization, but it really hadn't taken hold. And then finally there were mature businesses, businesses like Cisco, like Dell, that had been on this journey for 6 or 7 years and were evolving how they worked. And at that point it moved from maybe a CMO assigned responsibility to something that was enterprise-wide. It was actually pervasive across the business.
What do companies that are good at social business do well that other companies don't?
We talked about the strategy piece, right? So that there's something up front that says, here's why we're doing this. But then there's this constant experimentation and piloting that occurs, right? That this is a very fast advancing field, technology is changing, and the ability to bring in that new technology and apply it to a business problem. So if you think about social listening 2 or 3 years ago was something that was new. People would bring it in, but they weren't necessarily getting the business advantage. They'd have 1 or 2 people looking at it and it wasn't integrated. So then the question becomes, how do you start to apply that? How do you combine social data with your enterprise data? How does that give you insight? If you're a telecommunication company and you're worried about somebody switching services, how is the social data that they're talking about going to give you insights so when they call, you can give them a better offer?
So this would be like social listening in the sense of looking at chatter that's going on around a hashtag on Twitter or something on Facebook where your company is being mentioned. What does that actually look like inside a company?
Well, that's one of the questions is what actually happens with that data? Does it go to customer cares? Does it go to product innovation? There's a bunch of different ways that you could actually feed that. What I often find is that a company will have many tools, in some cases disparate, that aren't interconnected. That the next piece of this is how you integrate those and how you push it. And I think the examples that we had in our study this year, both Cisco and Dell, are companies that have been innovating and piloting for many years, and they continue to look and evolve, that they're not satisfied with where they are.
So they started small.
They start small, they pilot, the things that work they advance, the things that don't work that they drop or they shift.
Of the initiatives that were pilot initiatives in social, over 50% respondents said that they expected to return a short-term return on investment. And that's a problem with pilot studies because what you're doing with pilot is you're trying to experiment, you're trying to figure things out, you're taking short-term maybe losses at the expense of really figuring out how to do things for the long term.
Gerald, can you talk about the role culture plays at different kinds of companies in terms of becoming a social business?
I call culture the accelerant, or social media accelerates or amplifies culture. If you have a good culture, social media is going to unlock that. It's going to allow people to share, to collaborate, to help each other, not for collaboration's sake, but for helping one another out and deriving business value. If you have a more locked down culture, sort of cultural problems, social media can actually exacerbate those problems because it gives more opportunities for those to crop up.
Do all social businesses look the same if they're effective?
I don't think so. I think it depends on the marketplace and what you might see in a financial service industry in terms of how you're going to deal with high wealth individuals that you want to have a personal relationship living within regulations. So if they go into a branch, they're recognized and treated accordingly versus an airline passenger that maybe is the top passenger is frustrated by service versus someone that flies once a year. You're going to have very different operating models, but hopefully it's informed choice in terms of which squeaky wheel you choose to pay attention to because it's important to your business versus it's just always somebody looking for a reward by trying to put a signal out in social channels.
And social can give us the data to identify how important some of these customers are, even those that might not be directly, doing long-term business with us. There are, stories of hotels finding people with high clout scores or social media influence scores, that they treat them differently in the hope that experience is going to get out there more clearly.
I wanted to just touch briefly on the idea of content. You'd stress content, and I'm curious about the kind of content that companies should be creating and curating. How do you make meaningful content for social business?
I think it depends on who your target audience is. So if it's the marketing department trying to create content out there to engage its customers, it has to be something that's meaningful to the customer. Whether or not it's something that gives them more information about the products that they're looking for, or whether or not it's related to things that might interest them because of the interest they've had in specific products for the organization.
And on the marketing side, we'll often talk about reach, relevance, and recognition. And the marketing technology allows you to focus on what that customer is interested in. So if I'm shopping for a purse, what's the information flow? If I'm shopping for a lawnmower, what's the information flow that is giving me information relevant? So I think the consumer side is actually more understood. I think the enterprise piece is actually harder, right? From the aspect when you go to a collaboration site and you're saying this is where we're going to do work, and you go there and there's no content or very little has changed, you're not likely to go back. I think people will try once, they'll try twice, and they'll go, there's nothing here. Right. And then it's a really hard slog.
Yeah, so you need to achieve that critical mass. And if you don't have the critical mass, it's not going to be self-sustaining. The other side, however, is we are in an environment where content creation is rampant. And so curation is really key here, that it's not about creating information. We're not in an information scarcity environment, we're in an attention scarcity environment. So to the extent that you can help your customers, whether they be internal customers or external customers, provide them with the right information to pay attention to, that will also help.
I'm curious, what's an antisocial company look like? Are there introvert companies and extrovert companies when it comes to social business, or do those not apply?
It's interesting that you should say that, because there's an organization that we interviewed in our research this year, and they were, as you might describe, an introverted organization. They didn't really get their name out there. They actually use social to completely change their marketing and their brand, and so they're much more connected to communities and with the environments that they're in than they were previously, and they've actually seen some success from that.
How hard was that for them to do? And is this a complicated thing if you're a company that doesn't like being transparent or the limelight even?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to look at that. One is there's many companies that have intellectual property and information that they don't want out there, and that they'll be locked down for appropriate purposes. But for getting insights from what customers are saying about their products, what's being said about competitors, what's happening in the marketplace, those are signals that they need to take in and absorb and connect to other enterprise data. And then they have to decide how they're going to share or how they're going to put that information out there. But it's almost an expectation these days that there's going to be a social channel, in addition to traditional channels that companies will use.
And I would actually argue that all businesses, as you're dealing with people, all businesses are social businesses on some level or another, and are you appropriately social, are you effectively social, are the real questions. And these tools really provide new options for those types of interactions.
Which kind of tools are you thinking about?
Blogs, wikis, social networks, all the social media tools. I'd say the only true antisocial organization would be a completely automated assembly line that don't involve people.
Yeah. Well, the other way to look at that, and we did a look by industry, and this year we saw significant increases both in life sciences and in financial service industries. Highly regulated industries that have to follow very specific rules. But we saw a 2 to 4x increase in terms of the use of social or the promise of social in helping them achieve business objectives.
So they're figuring out how to kind of work within the constraints that are placed on them.
Well, they're also, regulatory industries are being more clear about what the constraints are. Previously, FINRA wouldn't say what was the appropriate way to use social media. Now you're starting to see, okay, here are some more guidelines, which is giving some companies more confidence in actually interacting with these technologies.
Gerald, can you talk a bit about how companies measure their sociability?
Well, there's lots of ways to measure. That's both the benefit and the curse of social media technologies, is it creates all this data. In the first year of the report, I think you guys noticed that the most common response was that companies didn't measure. This year, there has been a greater emphasis on the importance of measurement, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Now I think the question going forward is, what are the right things to measure? I think measurement abounds, but what are the things we want to measure, and which are the things that are getting us where we want to go business-wise?
So can you give me some specifics? So I am really kind of curious about what's a measurement that matters.
One thing that people are measuring frequently if you're using Facebook is the number of likes. The question is, what does that mean? For some companies, number of likes is probably really important if you're a very consumer products-driven company. If you are a large B2B company, the number of likes might not matter that much.
So at the point that you can actually show conversion relative to
Yes.
somebody, looked at your social channel, interacted with you, and it actually led to a sale. And what you're starting to see in social technologies, in particular in digital marketing, is the ability to connect the social data to the analytics and the back-end data and being able to show that. So the ability to hyper-target particular consumers and be able to see an ad in a particular region with a particular subsector of your customer base is actually paying off. And that allows you to focus, and see bottom line results. And I think you're going to see more and more of that over the next year or two, just based on what we're seeing in digital marketing technology.
So that's the external facing side. What about on internal? As companies are trying to create a more social culture internally, are there measurements there that are different that matter?
Yeah, I think so. There's one organization, a manufacturing company, that was trying to figure out how to improve their supply chain processes. And they've actually decreased the supply chain life cycle through social tools. So in incorporating social tools and changing some of their internal processes, they're able to reduce their life cycle from like 2 weeks down to a day or half a day.
And I think the key there is we're talking about business outcomes. I think a lot of companies will say, oh, we've got this many people using on our social media platforms, spending this much time, but unless it actually converts to business outcomes, I'm not sure it matters. Some will, some won't, and the elusive barrier or the elusive insight is which ones lead to those business outcomes.
And both from the MIT work as well as the client work that I do, I think that's a question a lot of companies are still asking, right? They've put an enterprise collaboration package in, and they're trying to say, well, how do we get more use and how do we get value? And a lot of the stories are still anecdotal. They'll talk about one region, understanding a problem, being able to pass it to a different region, and the speed at which that moves is much greater than it would if it would have occurred between email or because somebody didn't know somebody. So that social network effect of being able to put a question out, get a response, or be able to share something is a key piece of this. That until you've actually experienced kind of that aha moment, social business is a little bit elusive.
And then can repeat it. So we have that anecdote, and then how do we propagate that across the organization and the enterprise?
So does a mature social business look different from a business that's not mature? Can you be specific about how they look different?
I think they're more nimble. So, for example, what Doug just said about looking for internal talent. We found in our study that for mature organizations, 45% of them actually use social to find internal talent. And that compares to only 4% of organizations that are in the early stages of social. So clearly they're using the tools to get to something faster. It's the same thing for recruiting. It's the same thing for responding to chatter out in the marketplace. It's the same thing for responding to customer issues, as well as supply chain problems.
And I also think they clearly communicate to their employees appropriate expectations and ways to use social media. A lot of companies just say, here are the tools, but don't put any parameters around this is what you should be doing, this is what you shouldn't be doing, either in example or practice. We don't give the rules, the CEO doesn't model it. A lot of employees are afraid to use it because they don't know what the right way to do it is. And so good companies, mature companies, the employees know what their expectations and responsibilities are.
And those that do it well actually become the brand ambassadors for that company. It's interesting as we look at the talent pieces of this, and you're thinking about going to work for a company, if you go out into the social sphere, what's it like to work there? That's going to be some of the signals that you take and say, here's what the corporate brochures say, here's what the employees that are actually there say. And that's becoming very meaningful to companies. People are going to be able to understand, is there a product issue? And if so, what is it? So you'll get social data to suggest that. But you may have some perception issues in the marketplace because of that. Who are the people that can influence how people perceive your product? And your ability to provide them good information and insights to hopefully get them to change their opinion and to be able to broadcast that more to others, all of a sudden starts to become a way that work gets done. And the leading companies are starting to really make sense of that, whether it's on a product launch, a product issue, customer support. that's going to be a differentiator.
Does social business change the way work gets done?
It has to.
Can you give me an example?
These are just tools. And unless the work is going to change in response to the capabilities these tools provide, the value is going to be minimal. Unless you do allow people to communicate across functional barriers, unless you do allow them to respond more quickly to customers. You know, there's a classic anecdote of a company responding to a tweet. They met together, they formulated the appropriate response. 1 week later, they got the response out, which is far too late in the world of social media.
One of the key business challenges we find people look for is expertise finding in their organization. I've got a problem. How do I find the person that knows the answer, can help me solve this quickly? How do I put that out there? And that becomes an enabling function at the point that you can, get that information, at the speed that you need to. Not, hey, we found them a month later.
And that can be difficult in certain environments, right? I mean, one of the things that jumped out at me in this report was you mentioned a Gartner study saying that 80% of social media projects fail. And I thought to myself, that sounds like, every IT project ever.
Because they're making the same mistakes that they did in previous IT.
What are these mistakes, and why are we still making them?
The first thing is that they're not focused on business objectives. They're just implementing social because they feel like they have to implement social. And the key to success with social, one of the keys to success, is to really have a business problem or a business challenge that you're trying to solve, and use social to actually direct it towards that problem. So whether it's communicating with your customer or trying to speed up your internal communications and your supply chain, or trying to recruit new talent, I think you have to have a business objective in mind in order to implement social properly.
These are obvious, strong examples you're presenting us. Why do companies fail? What causes them to fail? Do employees actually not want to be social and you can't make them? What happens?
One of the things that has not come out of the report, but that I have anecdotally in my research, is that a lot of companies do this almost as an afterthought. They tack it on to their employees' existing job responsibilities. They don't give them appropriate incentives for if you are doing social. It's not part of their job reviews, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, busy employees with no time are not going to have the time to figure out how to use new tools. So you need this slack. You need to give them the freedom to figure out how to use these tools effectively to deliver business value.
But that goes back to our concept of strategy. You have to have a strategy for your social initiatives. And more than that, you have to be able to explain to your employee how this is going to impact their daily jobs and how it's going to make it easier or better. So without understanding that, they have no incentive to use the tool.
I think the low-hanging fruit, the one that gets, I think, all employees and managers excited, is, I would argue, email is also a social tool. And what if you started using these tools and we could cut email load by 25% or by 50%? That's when people say, oh, now I start seeing some of the benefits. So they already are collaborating. They already using social tools. They're just using one social tool for every business purpose. Now we have a whole golf bag full of tools to start using to address the business problems that we have.
If you're looking at something that's external, customer facing, what would be one or two things that a leader would want to say, this is what we're going to get from this business?
So there's a couple of pieces there, and if we think about customers from the external perspective first, the ability for customers to crowdsource information. So if you're working in a call center and a customer can provide insights to another customer that helps solve a problem, that's call center deflection. And the other thing we start to see is customers providing insights on products that end up leading to purchases. Now, clearly, you have to worry about your brand, and you have to think about, how you monitor that and when you choose to jump in, and when it's a community of customers versus something driven by the company. But there's clear ROI that we start to see when you don't have to answer a phone call, you don't have to send an email, and that the community handles that. And so those are, I think, some of the best examples. I think if you look at the supply chain side of this, one of the demands I'm seeing in the marketplace is I need to collaborate outside my enterprise. And I want to do it in such a way that I can work with my suppliers and my partners, but I want to do it in a secure way. I don't want to just leave it open-ended. And that what you're starting to see from a social technologies perspective is most of the leading vendors are starting to provide that capability. Whether they call it communities or partner portals, you're going to start seeing a lot more of that.
So it helps you manage your crowdsourcing. It helps you improve secure communications. It creates more potential ideas that you can innovate with.
Yeah, and it also, email has the point-to-point situation. If they're not on distribution, they don't see it. If you can put it into a collaborative environment that everyone that is working on that project can see it, it's more easy to respond.
An email also has the problem that if you're not involved, you can't overhear the conversation like you can on social. That I may not know Doug has the right answer to a problem, but I see him, share it with on a social platform, and I still get that knowledge. So it's not locked down in that point-to-point communication anymore.
Are the tools a barrier? Are the tools good enough to actually make this stuff simple?
I think they could be better. I think that they will continue to evolve as we figure out new ways to use social, and we start to learn what we may want to do. I think that the tools will evolve with that. They'll have more security. They'll be more integrated into the rest of the platform.
But I think the bigger problems are organizational, not technological.
That's right.
So we talked a bit about employees and their response. Doug, how does the social business change the kind of C-suite dynamic?
We looked at that this year, and certainly the chief marketing officer, given the consumer-facing piece, had a central role. We started to see the interaction between the CMO and the CIO changing, right? Because now the CMO is all of a sudden becoming the acquirer of technology. They can buy this as a service, they can buy it as a cloud-based solution. What's the role of the CIO? And so where we saw convergence or partnership between the CMO and CIO, that was a value add in an enterprise. And then we've also seen the emerging role of the chief digital officer. So whether it's chief social officer, chief digital officer, someone that's actually responsible for looking at how you manage these technologies coming into the workplace.
How do companies manage these new C titles effectively?
I think they're all still trying to figure it out to some degree, because at the point the CMO owns the social agenda, there's a bunch of business operations that aren't part of it. And one of the things that we saw as businesses matured and self-rated, they had somebody that at an enterprise or an operations level was leading the social or digital initiative. It wasn't just in the marketing thread.
Is there something that they should delegate to focus more on social?
Well, sure. I mean, the CEO can't be expected to be tweeting on a hourly basis. They can't be expected to do all this analysis, but they can be involved and they can be paying attention to these channels and have a team of people to help them understand what's going on in these social platforms.
It's no longer a one-way, here's what the CEO or that executive said, but it's a conversation that they can have with employees. They can get feedback, they can engage. How they use their staffs to support that, how they have digital mentors to help them get smart. We see different approaches in the marketplace, but that communication really is, I think, a key theme that companies that are doing it well are seeing value.
And a great example was in a recent book talking about EMC as a case study, where they were dealing with how to deal with the downturn and decrease revenues, and they used social as an opportunity to get the employees to talk about how do we cut costs, and rather than just doing broad layoffs, they had this conversation which helped the whole company feel like they were in it together.
So bottom line, if I'm not good at social business as a company, where am I in 2 years?
I think in 2 years you're a step behind. I really see this transformation cycle playing out, being extremely significant and playing out over a longer period of time. That if in 2 years you're going to be one step behind, but in 4 years you may be 3 steps behind, and it's going to be exponential.
And does it hit my bottom line? Does it mean I don't sell as much?
I think it's a cost of doing business in the 21st century world.
But I think there's a couple answers to that. One is if you look at regulated industries, some of them have been slow to dip their toe into the water because of concerns that if they listen to something, they see an adverse event, what the impact were. At some point, it's going to be an expectation that they should have known because the tools are widely available, and at what point does it flip? And that becomes an interesting discussion to have. It's also, I think, going to be an issue from a board perspective, that I think boards are going to start asking the C-suites, what's their social strategy? How are they thinking about this? This is such a pervasive channel that it can't be ignored. It's got to be part of it.
So what do we not understand about social business? Where are you going to be looking in the next level of research you're doing?
We've talked about the importance of measurement. I think the next step is analysis, is where do we provide the value? How do we understand this data to enable real business insights? And I think that's really going to be the next step of deriving value from social business.
The other piece that we're really interested in is what's the transition from early to developing to mature? And how much is it it's focused on a single leader driving it versus some broader organizational construct and the marketplace saying, this is really important, we need to be there. And how will that accelerate movement? across the industry.
Well, it does feel like it's accelerating, right? I mean, maturity to me is sort of, isn't that you get to sort of sit back in your lazy boy and you've got this all under control, because it's too much going on, right? So what does mature, how do you, as a mature company, respond?
I would argue, and this is the high-minded academic perspective here, I don't think we have any mature social media companies out there yet. I think what we will think of as maturity in 5 to 10 years, we don't even see on the horizon yet. That's how big the promise is. That's how big the disruption is going to be. I loved your analogy that it's shifting out of first gear, but we realize we're driving an 18-wheeler truck, and we have 18 gears to go or whatever to go.
And that's a really good point, Jerry, because we've noticed in our mature organizations that we've spoken to, they're constantly evolving. So they were mature, 2 years ago. They were considered mature ahead of the pack 2 years ago. They're still ahead of the pack, but they're continuing to do things. And I think that that's where social is headed. It's a continual evolution. We're not there yet.
And when we are there, we won't have to use the word social. It'll just be how business is done.
Exactly.
Yes.
We hope this discussion has you feeling more social. I want to thank our panelists, Doug Palmer and Nguyen Phillips of Deloitte, and Gerald Kane of Boston College's Carroll School of Management and guest editor for MIT's Sloan Management Review Social Business Initiative. For MIT Sloan Management Review, I'm Michael Fitzgerald saying thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.